Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating turning point in World War II history. We're going to look at how the US military completely upended centuries of established military doctrine. They figured out something totally counterintuitive, that strategic patience, literally just waiting an enemy out, was far deadlier and way more effective than a massive frontal assault. This is the wild story of how doing absolutely nothing broke one of the most highly trained armies in the world. Picture this. It's April 1945, and highly trained German soldiers are surrendering to Americans without a single shot being fired. The Americans are literally just sitting on hillsides, sipping coffee and waiting. When an American sergeant asked one uninjured, perfectly capable German soldier why he was throwing in the towel, the guy summed up the psychological collapse of an entire army in 5 exhausted words. What is the point in this?
So, the crucial question we have to ask ourselves is, what actually broke them? The answer kind of defies everything we think we know about war. It wasn't overwhelming firepower, it wasn't lightning-fast tank thrusts, and it definitely wasn't heroic frontal assaults. Nope. They were broken by something their highly sophisticated, centuries-old military manual had absolutely no name for and zero defense against: patience. But to understand how the Americans figured this out, we have to look back at the tragic math that forced them to rewrite their playbook.
Section 1. The Bloodbath at Brest. To truly grasp this radical shift in American strategy, we need to rewind the clock 8 months, to the summer of 1944. The Allies had just broken out of Normandy, and they desperately needed deep-water ports to funnel supplies into France. This urgency led them straight to the coastal city of Brest, where they learned a brutal, bloody lesson about giving the enemy exactly what they wanted. You see, the Germans utilized a very specific strategic concept called a Festung, or fortress. Adolf Hitler had explicitly designated Brest, along with several other Atlantic ports, as Festungs. Now, a Festung wasn't just a heavily defended city. It was a strategic trap meant to be defended to the absolute last man. The whole point? To absorb an enemy's strength. It was designed to force the Allies into committing massive resources to incredibly costly sieges, basically bleeding the Americans for every single inch of concrete, all while buying Germany precious time.
10,000. That was the horrific cost of playing right into German doctrine. Following their traditional playbook of decisive action, 75,000 Americans charged the concrete bunkers of Brest head-on. It was absolutely miserable fighting. House to house, room to room. 6 weeks later, the Americans finally took the city, but they had suffered 10,000 casualties in the process. And honestly, the worst part? The German commander had so thoroughly destroyed the harbor cranes and sunken vessels in the port that the Americans had bled for 6 weeks just to win a completely useless, ruined harbor.
Which brings us to the cage of containment. The horrifying math of Brest prompted American commanders to ask a question that would completely rewrite their playbook by September 1944. They started wondering, wait a minute, if a Festung is designed to bleed us only when we attack it, what happens if we just don't attack? From General Eisenhower's headquarters in September 1944, a genuinely shocking new order was issued for the remaining fortified French ports of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. These places held 60,000 heavily armed German troops. The order? They were to merely be contained. That's right. Instead of sending massive assault forces to storm the concrete, the Americans sent single, relatively green infantry divisions just to sit on the perimeter, hold the line, and wait.
Now, the German military was arguably the most doctrinally sophisticated in the world at the time, but it was built entirely on action and reaction, a blow and a counterblow. So when the Americans adopted this new strategy of refusing to engage, it created a massive psychological void for the Germans. Think about it. A fortress requires an enemy attack to justify its existence. Without an attack, a fortress isn't a stronghold anymore. It's just a cage. The Germans found themselves utterly paralyzed when the Americans simply refused to fight.
And by January 1945, the results of this waiting game were staggering. 113,000. That is the number of highly trained German soldiers, literally enough to staff 8 full divisions, just sitting completely idle in these useless coastal ports. The Americans had effectively locked them out of the war. Inside the ports, German soldiers were actually holding movie premieres. They were watching propaganda epics like Kohlberg, guarding submarine pens that had absolutely no fuel, and essentially guarding their own total irrelevance while their country was falling to the east. We move now to squeezing the Ruhr pocket, because this grand experiment in containment on the French coast was really just a rehearsal. It perfectly set the stage for the greatest encirclement of the war on the Western Front.
In March 1945, the Americans pulled off a miracle and crossed the Rhine River at Remagen. Moving incredibly fast, General Omar Bradley saw an opportunity to use geometry over direct assault. He sent his armies to encircle the Ruhr Valley, which was Germany's industrial heartland. And trapped inside this massive ring was Army Group B, commanded by the brilliant Field Marshal Walter Model.
Over just 18 days, the trap systematically closed. On April 1st, the ring sealed completely. But instead of sending 18 divisions charging into the cities for a bloody street-to-street fight like they did at Brest, Bradley ordered them to simply squeeze. Day by day, the pocket shrank. They used 1 million artillery shells and relentless air power not to storm the fortress, but to cut off its circulation. Without resupply, elite panzer divisions simply ceased to exist. They let the fortress slowly die of starvation.
The American containment steps here were incredibly methodical and, frankly, psychologically devastating. Step 1, seal the pocket. Step 2, advance only methodically, absolutely refusing to launch the kind of decisive charges that the Germans could counterattack. And finally, Step 3, the psychological kill shot. They sent loudspeaker trucks to the perimeter, broadcasting offers of hot coffee, food, and medicine in clear German. They essentially turned Hitler's own hold to the last man orders into the very instrument of the German army's destruction.
Let's look at the arithmetic of this strategy because it is absolutely devastating. For the exact same number of American casualties, 10,000, the direct brute force assault on Brest took 6 weeks and yielded 38,000 prisoners. But the squeeze and weight containment of the Ruhr pocket, it took just 18 days, and it yielded an unbelievable 317,000 German prisoners and 24 generals. Patience yielded almost 10 times the result in half the time. Defeated by patience, the sheer scale of the surrender in the Ruhr pocket was beyond anything the Allies had even imagined. Intelligence had estimated about 150,000 troops were trapped. The actual number was over 300,000. This containment strategy broke the German army from the inside out.
Trapped in this shrinking pocket, with his communication shredded and absolutely no enemy willing to give him an honorable, decisive battle, Field Marshal Walter Model asked his staff a haunting question. Has everything been done to justify our actions in the light of history? Recognizing the total futility of his situation, he did something unprecedented. He didn't formally surrender, which went against his strict Prussian code. Instead, he officially dissolved his entire army group, releasing hundreds of thousands of men to surrender on their own. Then, he walked into the woods and took his own life. He was caught right in the space between an oath he couldn't break and a reality he just couldn't change.
All of this leaves us with a really profound strategic realization, one that echoes far beyond World War II. The Americans learned the hard way that doing exactly what the enemy expects you to do is what gets you killed. Sometimes, the most devastating weapon you can deploy against a highly structured reactionary opponent isn't a bigger bomb, a faster tank, or a massive frontal assault. Sometimes the absolute deadliest move of all is simply letting them wait. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it leaves you thinking a little bit differently about the true nature of power, strategy, and patience.